大家好，我是华尔街电视的小安，为大家主持一档新的节目《亚洲大眼睛》。什么样的内容，您慢慢看就知道了。那本期节目会谈及“一带一路”，一个似乎计划永远赶不上变化的倡议，一个似乎永远无法达成共识的计划。越南虽然一直对加入北京“一带一路”倡议很谨慎，但习近平早前访问越南时将根据倡议建议提供资助，这让河内面临压力。越南同时寻求平衡与中国和美国的关系。越南等东南亚国家在中国“一带一路”地图上占据中心位置。美国外交关系委员会分析，东南亚是“一带一路”的陆带与海路。那分析人士就说，虽然一些地区国家欢迎“一带一路”资金，但越南却表现得很谨慎。美国之音报道，新加坡尤索夫伊萨东南亚研究所的黎宏和就表示，越南说支持中国“一带一路”倡议，越南领导人经常参加中国组织的“一带一路”论坛，但越南实际上并不积极参加“一带一路”框架内的项目或接受“一带一路”的投资。中国驻越南大使熊波2021年11月曾说，“一带一路”包括一系列的大型越南项目，但越南还没有公开宣布“一带一路”的任何项目。黎宏和就认为，这体现越南对通过官方渠道得到的中国贷款的审慎心态。华盛顿战略与国际研究中心东南亚计划资深研究员穆雷希伯特就说，越南称赞“一带一路”主要是安慰中国的外交姿态，河内对“一带一路”基础建设没有真正的兴趣，但接受中国公司的地产和制造投资。专家就说，越南的审慎态度源于两国岛屿主权纠纷。这两个共产党国家尽管意识形态相同，但面临领海冲突。那越南多次指责中国派船进入其专属经济区，并在南中国海军事化，侵犯了越南的主权。希伯特就说，越南不想在南中国海存在严重分歧时，在重要基建上欠中国的人情。那专家就说，同中国过去的合同项目的不良经验是越南担心“一带一路”的另一个原因。那吉林河东铁路的造价从最初估计的5亿5280万美元上升到8亿6800万美元。这条河内首条都市铁路全长13公里，由于中国承包商的延长落实，导致拖延将近10年，引发越南人的愤怒。黎宏和就说，教训让越南对中国贷款十分谨慎，不管是不是“一带一路”，中国贷款有使用中国承包商和设备的义务，越南不想重蹈覆辙。越南国家经济大学中国经济研究计划主任范世胜就说，“一带一路”大约70%的项目涉及中国承包商或工人。河内拒绝北京建设云盾芒街高速铁路的贷款，不许华为公司参加越南5G 通信基础设施的开发，理由是担心国家安全。尽管“一带一路”在很多贫困国家帮助建设了公路、铁路和基础设施，也让一些国家深陷债务。那另一方面，意大利带头退出“一带一路”，表示协议的经济保证从未兑现。意大利在欧中峰会开幕前致函中国政府，正式决定退出“一带一路”计划。此消息经媒体披露后，意中双方均保持低调态度。分析就认为，意大利担心退出“一带一路”可能引发中国的经济报复。那意大利总理梅洛尼计划在今年访问中国的行程，似乎也不大可能会实现。意大利是首个跟中国签署“一带一路”合作谅解备忘录的 G7 成员国。该协议是在2019年3月习近平访问意大利与前孔特政府签署的。该备忘录有效期为5年，意大利在备忘录到期前选择不续签，并推出“一带一路”倡议。意大利政界和观察人士认为，意大利正在选择倾向大西洋主义的战略路线。意大利总理梅洛尼就表示，他认为他们应该改善跟中国在贸易和经济方面的合作。新丝绸之路这一工具没有产生预期效果。意大利现任总理梅洛尼去年在竞选期间就承诺，一旦当选将会退出与中国的“一带一路”合作。意大利县政府在公开谈论“一带一路”项目时，更多的是将该项目终止归咎于经济原因。那意大利副总理兼外交部长安东尼奥·塔雅尼在今年9月初访问北京时就表示，“一带一路”未给意大利带来预期的经济收益。 在签署“一带一路”备忘录后，意大利对中国的出口增幅不大，但与中国的贸易逆差进一步扩大。同时，法国、德国等未加入“一带一路”的国家对中国出口表现则优于意大利。在美国等西方阵营与中国对抗加剧的背景下，意大利此时较少提及背后的政治因素。意大利马可潘内拉全球法治委员会秘书长马泰奥·安吉奥里表示，意大利决定退出“一带一路”的战略，是为了与欧盟在2021年一项决议保持协调一致。这是一项要求欧盟成员国在整个欧盟层面上面对挑战和机遇时保持协调的决定，同时也是主要面对来自中国的挑战。他认为这是反思，是时候进行战略思考。这也是为什么意大利正在仔细绑定下一步计划。首先，意大利将成为下一届7国集团轮值主席国，7国集团将在卡普里岛举行峰会，这是政府的重要责任。安吉奥里就指出，意大利选择在欧盟领导人访问中国之前退出“一带一路”，一方面是意大利即将面临最后期限，那必须向中国方面发出通知，退出“一带一路”是经过深思熟虑早已决定的结果，与中国的协议有重大缺陷，贸易没有得到改善。此外，欧盟将中国视为系统性竞争对手。中国外交部发言人汪文斌对意大利决定退出“一带一路”表示，今年10月，第3届“一带一路”国际合作高峰论坛在北京成功举办，包括意大利在内的151个国家和41个国际组织代表参会，形成458项成果，释放了团结协作、开放共赢的清晰信号，体现出共建“一带一路”的巨大感召力和全球影响力。中方坚决反对抹黑破坏共建“一带一路”合作，反对阵营对抗以及制造割裂。那除此之外，中国官方对意大利退出“一带一路”没有更多的表态。那在意大利决定退出“一带一路”后，意大利方面多次向中国保证将继续发展战略合作伙伴关系。梅洛尼就此前表示，是否退出“一带一路”将交给国会讨论，然后再做决定。然而，到目前为止，意大利国会并未就退出“一带一路”的议案进行投票表决，而实际上，众议院和参议院的外交委员会已经讨论过退出“一带一路”的问题。而米兰晚邮报的报道就披露说，退出“一带一路”的决定没有公开，这是同中国当局沟通并取得同意的结果。这个举措对双方来说都非常方便。罗马希望可以避免北京的反应，特别是经济报复。北京也希望限制意大利离开“一带一路”计划在公开层面上的负面影响。罗马这一次直接向北京表达了取消协议的意思。罗马原本希望和北京商谈更改协议条款，避免这份在2019年签署的协议在5年到期后自动续签，以达到取消协议的目标。但是经过数周几个来回以后，北京拒绝了意方的要求，最终意大利在截止期限3个星期前向中国发出了通知。那为实现退出“一带一路”的目标，今年夏季就有意大利就派出官员到中国实施铺垫。意大利总理梅洛尼访华行程未定，但总统马塔雷拉将在2024年初访问中国，纪念马克波罗逝世700周年。意大利外交部长塔亚尼也表示，双方将在意大利维罗纳召开政府间会议，讨论国际贸易问题。他说，和中国仍然会有良好关系，尽管这个国家在全球范围内是竞争对手，不参加“一带一路”不是对中国的负面行动。那2023年是习近平提出共建“一带一路”倡议的10周年，中国近期也成功举办了第3届“一带一路”国际合作高峰论坛。然而，“一带一路”倡议究竟是不是一项很好的项目？我相信大家心里都有个数。来到2023年的年末，我相信大部分国家、媒体、民众所关注的，并不是“一带一路”究竟带来了哪些成功的建设与案例，而是更关注于“一带一路”为各国所带来的国际债务问题。谢谢大家，这就是本期的亚洲大眼睛，希望听到您的意见，留言在节目下方。
大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道，节目录制时间为美东时间12月28日。这期热点深度关注傅晓田案有进展，关联关键人物被判刑。北京时间2023年12月28日，广西壮族自治区南宁市中级人民法院一审公开开庭审理了广东省人大常委会原党组成员、副主任陈如桂受贿一案。 广西壮族自治区南宁市人民检察院指控，2003年至2022年，被告人陈如桂利用担任广州市建委主任、市建设工委书记、广州市政府党组成员、秘书长、广州市委常委、副市长、广州市委副书记、政法委书记、中山市委书记、深圳市委副书记、市长、广东省人大常委会党组成员、副主任等职务上的便利以及职权、地位形成的便利条件，为相关单位和个人在工程承揽、项目推进、企业经营等事项上提供帮助，直接或通过其亲友非法收受相关单位和个人给予的财物，共计折合人民币 1.08 亿余元。1年前，2022年12月，陈如桂被双开。据中央纪委国家监委通报，陈如桂丧失理想信念，背弃初心使命，对党不忠诚不老实，处心积虑对抗组织审查，无视中央8项规定精神，违规收受礼金，违规借用管理和服务对象住房，接受可能影响公正执行公务的宴请，不按规定报告个人有关事项，违规帮助亲属调整职务，权力观扭曲，利用职权和职务上的影响帮助亲属承揽工程，吸收存款谋取利益，搞权色、钱色交易，践踏纪法底线，与不法商人沆瀣一气，大搞政商勾连，隐身幕后收钱敛财，利用职务便利为他人在企业经营、项目推进等方面谋利，并非法收受巨额财物。陈如桂，广东连江人，生于1962年9月，今年61岁。为何陈如桂极有可能是傅晓田案的关键人物之一，是因为有传闻称，深圳前市长陈如桂是剑桥小田花园幕后赞助人。时间回到2019年，当年5月10日，位于剑桥大学丘吉尔学院的小田花园正式开园了。小田花园开幕之后的第2天，也就是2019年5月11日，花园迎来了第一批海外访客，就是深圳市长陈如桂一行。在花园里，小田亲自解说，陈如桂还见到了剑桥的中国留学生，鼓励他们学成归国，到深圳建设家乡。关于傅晓田的公开个人经历，相信不少人已经不陌生了。傅晓田是1983年生人，本科毕业于北京语言大学和北京大学，获英语语言文学和经济学双学位。毕业后，傅晓田进入英国剑桥大学丘吉尔学院深造，于2007年再获硕士研究生学位。2009年，傅晓田正式加入凤凰卫视，成为一名驻英记者，主要负责英国及欧洲地区的时政新闻报道。2013年，傅晓田成为了《风云对话》的主持人，后兼任制片人。这个栏目原先由资深知名媒体人阮次山主持，阮先生德高望重，在新闻媒体行业称得上是大前辈，谁能想到《风云对话》已主到傅晓田手中。2016年，傅晓田以回馈母校的名义，向剑桥大学丘吉尔学院捐赠了一所花园。剑桥大学将这座花园命名为傅晓田花园，并举办命名仪式。仪式现场，各国名流汇聚一堂。时任联合国教科文组织总干事的伯克娃专门为傅晓田录制祝贺视频。此时此刻，傅晓田年仅33岁。当时深圳市长陈如桂是特地去了一趟小田花园，给傅晓田捧场吗？并不尽然。根据当时的新闻，2019年5月10日至12日，市长陈如桂率深圳市政府代表团访问英国。报道强调的是，陈如桂这趟是工作，要落实粤港澳大湾区规划建设这一重大国家战略， 面向英国宣传推介粤港澳大湾区的重大机遇，推动吸引创新人才、科教机构、科技创新等高端创新资源要素在大湾区急剧发展，进一步增强深圳核心引擎功能，更好发挥创新引领作用，为全面形成对外开放新格局做出积极贡献。在英国访问期间，市政府代表反复强调的3个字，当然不是傅晓田，而是大湾区。根据报道，陈如桂，中国驻英国大使馆临时代办陈文，英中贸易协会主席沙逊勋爵，伦敦金融城特别代表卡克特以及众多高科技企业、创新创业企业参加活动。而这位中国驻英大使馆临时代办陈文也出席了小田花园的揭幕仪式，他和陈如桂是前后脚给傅晓田捧场，并不在同一天。当然，即便是第2天去的，傅晓田也是亲自接待讲解。距离陈如桂踏访小田花园到备查，一共3年的时间。官方对陈如桂的通报是：践踏纪法底线，与不法商人沆瀣一气，大搞政商勾连，隐身幕后收钱敛财，利用职务便利为他人在企业经营、项目推进等方面牟利，并非法收受巨额财物。深圳的市长会去一个私人花园捧场，他看中的是傅晓田，还是傅晓田背后的某个人呢？一位中国时政观察家向华尔街电视分析，一般来讲，中共官员出席民间活动都是非常谨慎小心，基本上很少参加地方商界项目的活动，地方官会出席一些必要活动，比如政府扶持的项目的开工仪式。一般政府官员都有个习惯，不会出席影视明星、企业家的活动，从中央到地方都是这样，避免出现把柄，被指给什么人站台。你看习近平上台后，基本没有出现民营企业家的活动中，就是因为搞不清楚，怕有什么猫腻。陈如桂出席傅晓田的活动，等于证明他在政治上非常愚蠢。类似这样的活动每天都有，对于官员来说，轻易参加等于踏入陷阱，即便邀请方式有亲密关系，比如亲戚朋友、特殊关系、民间企业。市长、市委书记们都是等典礼结束再去悄悄参加，不会公开。陈如桂真的是在政治上非常幼稚。好了，以上就是今天热点深度所有内容，更多资讯可以关注6度简报网站，网址是6dobrief.com，在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个视频再见。
Chapter 1: A New Era. Xi Jinping steers China's economy on a different path. After 4 decades of market reform and global integration, China's economy is at a critical juncture. It now faces the most challenging phase of economic development as a new growth model is needed to break through the middle-income trap and become more innovative and productive. The third plenum of the 20th Central Committee in fall 2023 will shape China's economic trajectory for years to come. At the third plenum in 2013, Xi Jinping introduced his priorities for political and economic reform, a careful balance between the role of the state and the market. Many abroad were hopeful he might be the reformer China needed, even as his reforms represented a compromise between the more liberal and more conservative forces in the party. Xi Jinping's adjustments to China's economic policies aim to deal with the negative side effects of what he terms unbalanced and inadequate growth, a legacy of the previous growth model. This includes, for example, a highly leveraged financial system and a real estate sector accounting for nearly 30% of GDP. Simultaneously, they are also a response to perceived Western containment and its efforts to limit China's access to technology. Xi Jinping wants new kind of modernity for China by 2049, achieving key milestones and development targets by 2035. The path forward under Xi Jinping will lay the foundation for the Chinese Communist Party's, CCP's, aim of national rejuvenation, returning a strong and prosperous modern China to the center of the global economy and innovation by 2049. Achieving this with China's special economic model, socialism with Chinese characteristics, would establish a system that can outcompete the liberal market economic system and prove that Chinese-style modernization can be dynamic and innovative. If successful, the CCP could establish China as the superior economic system. But there is also a real risk that the economy will hit a period of stagnation during Xi Jinping's third term, as the country confronts a complex set of domestic and international challenges. Title I policy priorities are unlikely to meaningful change even as economy is facing headwinds. At the start of his third term, Xi Jinping clarified his vision of how the CCP should reach its targets for the country. Over his first two terms, economic policy shifted towards political, ideological, and security objectives. But 2022 marked a sea change for Xi Jinping's policy priorities and their attendant trade-offs. Xi Jinping's ideological views permeated economic policy, to the detriment of economic growth. To reverse the downturn after the prolonged lockdown of its zero-COVID policy, China has downplayed ideology in 2023, and pragmatism has returned to economic policymaking. This is not a course reversal, but rather a matter of tone and timing. Despite softer language and a less ideological tone, the flurry of rules and regulations imposed in 2020 to 2022 to strengthen the party's grip over the economy have not been abolished. They are simply taking a back seat to boosting investor and consumer confidence amid a disappointing post-COVID recovery. China's leadership has gone into overdrive to woo foreign investors who have become wary of China, not only due to growth prospects but also to political dynamics, both in China and at home. China is now an economic giant, accounting for around 20% of global gross domestic product, GDP, and 30% of global manufacturing. Xi Jinping no longer feels bound to the foundations that guided his predecessors. In the past, leaders tolerated considerable risk in their domestic reforms in order to maximize economic development opportunities. These included the massive displacement of capital and labor with Zhu Rongji's state-owned enterprise, SOE, reforms, or Deng Xiaoping's agenda of opening up and pushing integration with the global economy. This gamble has paid off, and Xi Jinping is setting his sights on taking China to a higher level of development and global influence. In pursuit of the second centennial goal, 100th anniversary of the PRC, Xi Jinping has shifted the party baseline from focusing on economic development to coordinating development and security. This marks a new direction that emphasizes party control over the free hand of the market and puts a greater priority on minimizing risks and achieving political and geopolitical goals than on economic development. China's economic policymaking in the last decade was characterized by an urgency to build an economy that could withstand external shocks. Increasingly, its policy priorities are geared toward a geopolitically oriented economy that is obsessed with US-China competition and deprioritizes the emphasis on social development. A key metric in measuring success is whether or not China can eclipse the US economy. This depends on many factors, including GDP growth in China and the US, inflation and exchange rates. This offers a range of possible outcomes, see Exhibit 1. Following years of strong growth, China's next phase of catching up will be accompanied by slower growth. But success is also measured in relative terms. China sees the US and the West as in decline. Regardless of its relative size to the US economy, China is back on the world stage and will remain an economic heavyweight. Globalization and economic relations with China are likely to be profoundly different in the future. This year's third plenum will have historic significance comparable to the opening up and reform process that began in 1978 or the country's WTO accession in 2001. But while China's rise was largely seen as an opportunity in Europe and elsewhere, fundamental changes are at play that could, once again, shake up the world economy. The third plenum is taking place at an inflection point for China's economy, with several key factors shaping its future development. Point 1. A period of slower and more volatile GDP growth. China's economy is undergoing an inevitable structural slowdown after a period of rapid growth. This requires adjustments to its growth model. engineering a stable economic slowdown has become more difficult amid China's disruptive policy shifts in response to external and internal challenges such as COVID-19, high debt levels, and the prioritization of national strategic goals in face of rising geopolitical risk. Point 2. Quickly rising innovation capacities that have yet to yield productivity dividends. China has made remarkable strides in boosting its innovation capacity, becoming a cutting-edge nation in a number of technologies ranging from traditional sectors such as high-speed rail to emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence. At the same time, China's total productivity growth has decelerated. Point 3. China's gravitational pull on the global economy. Despite slower growth, China is an economic heavyweight aiming to challenge the global economic order, establish itself as an innovation power, and expand its global economic footprint. Point 4. The politicization of globalization. Geopolitical risks and efforts to strengthen economic security in China and worldwide are shaping international global supply chains and innovation. Point 5. Non-convergence with liberal market economies. China is seeking its own development path that serves the goal of perfecting the Chinese socialist system. Under the leadership of the CCP, new theoretical foundations of economic development are being created with an emphasis on tech-centered economic nationalism. Title II Ideology meets Economic Realities. Trade OFFSIN's Tech-Centered Economic Nationalism. Looking forward, a key challenge will be reconciling Xi Jinping's national strategic priorities with economic prospects, including jobs and income. China is neither ending its era of reform and opening up nor returning to the closed Mao years that preceded it. Instead, its internal reform and external opening agendas are taking place under fundamentally different conditions with new political parameters, incentives, and drivers. In the past, internal reform was heavily driven by maximizing development opportunities, while external opening was about accepting interdependencies to accelerate growth and expand export opportunities with liberal market economies. Under Xi Jinping, internal reform is about fine-tuning control of the economy to steer it through domestic hard times with an aging population and sluggish productivity growth. External opening aims to reduce interdependencies with liberal market economies that recently began to restrict China's access to their key technologies. Xi Jinping's answer to these problems is technology, to deal with a shrinking workforce, enhance productivity, and decrease reliance on the US and other countries Beijing believes to be Washington's pawns. The current technology-centered agenda has set the country on a clear trajectory, though its success is far from guaranteed. The sustainability of Xi Jinping's path will be put to the test when ideology-driven ambitions clash with economic reality. For example, despite China establishing itself as a global innovation power, total factor productivity growth has slowed from 22% between 2003 and 2011 to only 5% between 2011 and 2019. Aligning national strategic goals with the national well-being is causing tensions. Another example is the popular backlash in November 2022 over economically stifling zero-COVID policies triggered a rapid course correction, with further corrections taking place amid a sluggish economic recovery in 2023. But this is no paradigm change or return to economic pragmatism. There may be bigger tests ahead if Xi Jinping continues down his chosen path and the strategy fails. See Exhibit 2. Title 311 has chosen China's trajectory, but other actors are choosing how to respond. While countries may only exert limited pressure on China to deviate from Xi Jinping's chartered course, there are plenty of other ways to affect its chances for success. Somewhat oversimplified, countries with liberal market economies may continue to give China access to their markets and technologies, or they may further restrict it. China, on the other hand, may accept economic and technological interdependencies with liberal market economies, or further pursue self-reliance. The issue is that every step China takes towards self-reliance pushes liberal market economies to restrict China's access to their markets and technology. In turn, this drives China further down the road of self-reliance. In that sense, China and liberal market economies are on a path toward long-term, profound disruption to economic and technological globalization, despite likely worse outcomes for all actors. The net positive result for all would be to restore globalization with all sides willing to accept common rules and norms as well as interdependencies. This goes as much for the US, EU and Japan depending on China as it does China depending on them. But the disincentive for China to reverse course and abandon its self-reliance campaign is that liberal market economy countries might cut it off anyway, leaving it too far behind to catch up. The disincentive for liberal market economies to allow China access to their markets is that Beijing might maintain its path to self-reliance and succeed, unleashing China's geopolitical power and replacing them in the global economy. The problem of renewed globalization is that, for each side, the net gain from the best-case scenario is less beneficial than the net damage is from the worst-case scenario, meaning countries have more incentive to take damage-limiting action than to pursue risky opportunities. Furthermore, the growing distrust between China and liberal market economies and previous actions by both China and the US have put everyone in a poor position. Title 4 High Stakes: China's Economic Development is Shaping the Global Order. The evolution of China's political economy, market reforms and integration in the global economy under Xi Jinping will shape its economic path forward. Its development also very much depends on how advanced economies control access to technology. Success or failure not only depend on China's own performance but how liberal market democracies respond to the current structural shifts shaking up the global order. Dealing with an economically large, technological capable, and systemically non-convergent China requires a deep understanding of the structural shifts in China's next stage of development. 1. What are the key building blocks of China's political economy under Xi Jinping's ideology? 2. Which party and state measures are used to steer economic actors? 3. How will the CCP attempt to secure the socio-economic base? 4. How will innovation look under an increasingly authoritarian regime? 5. How will China pursue global integration? Our baseline scenario is that China will continue down Xi Jinping's chosen path, at least as long as he is in power, with continued uncertainty over the success or failure of his strategy. Keen to ensure success, Xi Jinping recently codified his own economic thought in a new development model worthy of his new era. This vision aims to contend with, as he puts it, changes unseen in a century, and is matched with a growing set of measures to shape the economy. These party and state measures aim to operationalize his ideology and galvanize all economic actors to strive for strategic goals, all to enable the success of the 2049 dream. Chapter 2 Xi Jinping's policies serve strategic national goals beyond growth. After the Mao years, China experienced 4 stages of economic development, each characterized by a distinct approach to political economy in respective generations of leadership: de-radicalization, reform and opening up, liberalization, stabilization, and now, under Xi Jinping, securitization, which means assessing all political economy issues as though they were security issues for China. During his first 2 terms, Xi Jinping harnessed the CCP's greatly diminished confidence in market forces as the central driver in resource distribution after the global financial crisis to advance his economic ideology. As Deng Xiaoping de-radicalized the economy in the 1980s, state-owned enterprises, SOEs, remained the undisputed champions, with privately owned enterprises, POEs, only allowed at the cottage industry level, as pragmatism and experimentation took hold. As POEs emerged, the Jiang Zemin era of the 1990s saw the reforms of his premier, Zhu Rongji, who liberalized the economy with a focus on SOE reform under the mantra of grasp the large and let go the small. The state held on to hundreds of the country's most important firms, Lenin's commanding heights of the economy, while the rest were privatized or allowed to collapse. From then on, the national SOEs were largely used to advance the strategic goals of the CCP. Under Hu Jintao in the 2000s, liberalization slowed and SOEs retrenched to stabilize the economy in light of the global financial crisis. SOEs developed infrastructure, supported employment, provided social security, and maintained China's industrial foundation, independent of market forces. Meanwhile, POEs pursued profits, job creation, development, and innovation. Trust in market forces stagnated under Hu, after growing under Deng and Jiang, and then deteriorated under Xi Jinping, see Exhibit 3. Title 111 breaks from the Reform ERA and envisions strategic roles for all companies. Xi Jinping initially wanted to continue Hu's approach to the SOE-POE divide, as expressed in the 2013 Third Plenum Decision document naming both state ownership and market forces as central pillars to development. But faced with emerging and clear risks in 2015-18, Xi Jinping shifted course and pushed back against more reform-minded factions in the party. Key triggers were financial instability, highly leveraged companies, fears of a housing bubble, financial market turbulence in 2015-16. This triggered a deleveraging campaign in 2016 and set the seeds for crackdowns on real estate and tech, to control speculative investments and markets not aligned with national strategic goals. B. Foreign dependencies, already suspicious of the U.S., trust in China's dependency on foreign tech evaporated with the U.S. trade and tech wars starting in 2018 and U.S. President Donald Trump's threats to block telecommunications firm ZTE from American technology. The steady shifts in Xi Jinping's management of the economy are underscored by an attempt to construct or at least project a coherent economic governance model. As a somewhat clearer picture of his vision for the economy emerges, internally promoted as Xi Jinping economic thought for a new era, Deng's era of opening up and reform looks like a transitional period, now possibly succeeded by an era of security and control. According to China's leaders, the country is on a path to completing a historic transformation from standing up and becoming prosperous to growing strong. China's reform process and global integration have substantially advanced living standards and science and technology capabilities. But to reach the new development stage of socialist modernization by 2035, the CCP under Xi Jinping is resorting to policies that held back China's development for decades: ideology, centralization, securitization, and reversing the separation of party and state. After the 19th Party Congress in 2017 and the subsequent Central Economic Work Conference, Xi Jinping economic thought became the CCP's central ideology shaping China's economic development. Loyalty to Xi Jinping and his agenda have always mattered most, as manifested in Xi Jinping's omnipresent anti-corruption campaign launched in 2012. But beyond loyalty and ideological adherence, Xi Jinping thought also demands competence. Xi Jinping still believes that technocrats are best placed to advance the country and has promoted STEM graduates to leadership positions during his tenure at a higher pace than under Hu Jintao. Those cascading requirements, loyalty, ideological alignment, and competence were on full display in the selection of cadres elevated to top leadership at the 20th Party Congress. Competing factions, such as the Communist Youth League, were sidelined while close contacts of Xi Jinping rose to the surface. Anyone with a voice that could have pushed back on Xi Jinping's strategies was suppressed, be it Li Keqiang or Hu Jintao's protege, Hu Chunhua. Meanwhile, promotions were in line for Xi Jinping loyalists like Li Chang, who stuck to the zero-COVID ideological position that locked down Shanghai for weeks in 2022. Xi Jinping's economic thought is laying the key building blocks for China's economic system. It is defining the role of the state for guiding economic actors and expectations for companies and society, as well as how China engages with the rest of the world. Even more ideological are the goals laid out by the CCP and the means by which Xi Jinping intends to reach them. Economic liberalization as a goal in and of itself is dead in Beijing. It is not seen as compatible with the political system. Xi Jinping's ideological choice has been to extract the tool of market forces from the scrap heap of economic liberalization and to use it only for specific goals, while building out new economic measures in which the party state plays a central role. The CCP dominates the economic system in a similar way it does the political system, through strategic guidance and controlling market mechanisms, and by demanding strict obedience from those companies and individuals that can contribute to national strategic goals. Title II: Xi's economic thought is a continuation in some areas and a clean break in others. Some of the clearest origins of what would later become Xi Jinping economic thought were revealed in August 2020 when Xiushi, the CCP's chief theory journal, published a speech he had delivered on November 23, 2015, one of his earliest speeches as paramount leader overviewing his ideological perspective on China's political economy. The speech, made during a study session of the Politburo, outlines key priorities in Xi Jinping's political economic strategy in a post-Third Plenum and pre-19th Party Congress interregnum. Titled "Unceasingly Open Up the Borders of Contemporary Chinese Marxist Political Economy," it focuses on 6 key goals. First, adhere to the people-centered development philosophy. Second, adhere to the new development concept. Third, uphold and improve the basic socialist economic system. Fourth, uphold and improve the basic socialist distribution system. Fifth, adhere to the direction of socialist market economic reform. Sixth, adhere to the basic national policy of opening up. Over the rest of his first and second terms in office, these core tenets of what would become Xi Jinping economic thought were matched with Xi Jinping-specific slogans and campaigns. The core goal: adhere to a people-centered development philosophy. This is Xi Jinping's primary aim for his new era. At the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping changed the principal contradiction at the core of CCP thinking from was between the ever-growing material and cultural needs of the people and backward social production to between unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life. Instead of the previous approach of development at all costs, Xi Jinping has now put quality over quantity into the development mix. Subsidiary goals adhere to the new development concept of quality over quantity. Xi Jinping frequently emphasizes the need to focus on quality development rather than merely driving up the numbers, meaning people-centered development. However, Xi Jinping also often elaborates that the new development concept must balance innovation, coordination, greening, openness, and sharing. The economic model uphold and improve the basic socialist economic system and adhere to socialist market economic reform. This has been interpreted in the West as raising the role of market forces in allocating resources. Xi Jinping has repeated many times that there are two pillars to China's economic model, one public and one non-public. In other words, socialism with Chinese characteristics only works with both strong SOE and strong POE sides to the economy, referred to as the two unwavering, meaning unwavering support for both. Economic distribution uphold and improve the basic socialist distribution system. In China, the basic socialist distribution system is based on distribution according to work, although multiple parallel systems for distribution exist. Xi Jinping would later spotlight distribution in prioritizing common prosperity. The term dates back to Mao, but is known from Deng Xiaoping's famous quote, "Let some get rich first, then lead the rest into common prosperity." Xi Jinping quickly clarified that China will not revert to broad redistribution. Common prosperity is a goal, but not via means like welfare universalism. Over the rest of his first and second terms in office, these core tenets of what would become Xi Jinping economic thought were matched with Xi Jinping-specific slogans and campaigns. China's global economic position adhere to the basic national policy of opening up. Xi Jinping has no intention of isolating China and is instead eager to grow China's role in the global economy. His signature foreign economic policy has been the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, China's major infrastructure project to connect Asia, Africa, and Europe via land and sea. This would grow into Beijing's dual circulation strategy, which aims to alter China's position in the global economy, remaining open to the global economy while boosting domestic demand. Unlike Deng's idea to drive growth by luring technology, investment, and raw materials to produce low to mid-value goods for export, Xi Jinping aims to import raw materials and lower-value goods and export higher-value goods, tech, and outbound investment. Some core priorities of Xi Jinping's economic thought were part of his 2015 speech. Innovation and technology have begun to play a much more central role in Xi Jinping's economic policymaking. The U.S. trade war gave this momentum, especially actions against Chinese tech companies and recent export controls. Xi Jinping has begun to heavily emphasize the all-of-nation effort to close key technology gaps. Consumption-driven growth is also a major focus. This has always been a goal, and is the second half of the dual circulation strategy, external circulation being China's position in the global economy and internal circulation being domestic consumption as the key driver of growth, rather than exports. See Exhibit 4. Title 3. The trade war and the pandemic catalyzed deeply rooted self-reliance in Xi's economic thought. Xi Jinping consolidated his power base over his first two terms, but there were limitations as to how aggressively he could push his then still evolving economic ideology. First, it was difficult to get buy-in for his radical approach to self-reliance from most economic actors at a time when China had virtually complete access to foreign markets and technologies. Second, the CCP's very legitimacy had, since the crackdown on the Tiananmen Square protests, been dependent on securing economic development gains in return for political silence from the masses, meaning that Xi Jinping needed to keep growth strong, irrespective of his ideology. Two things happened to change this: the U.S.-China trade and tech war and the pandemic. Self-reliance is a long-standing principle in CCP ideology, indeed, of any communist or more generally authoritarian ideology. However, aside from more ideologically conservative types in the CCP and China's major SOEs, much of China's private sector, scientific community, and broader society were not behind the idea. The U.S.-China trade war, and the more significant tech war that began with restrictions on Huawei and ZTE, changed that around 2018. Private companies faced being technologically strangled by the U.S. For the first time in decades, there was truth behind the idea of an all-of-nation effort to close the tech gap and achieve self-reliance. This opened up considerable political space for Xi Jinping to push his economic ideology, see Exhibit 5. The pandemic did something similar. China's initial failure to contain the virus was later met with an effective zero-COVID policy that, despite its often draconian nature, worked for the first 2 years. Compared to the rest of the world, China seemed stable and back to normal life, something state media was happy to demonstrate with coverage of global chaos next to rosy reports about Beijing's leadership. This gave Xi Jinping political space to deprioritize economic growth as a measure of success in pursuit of other political goals. This is not to say that multiple crackdowns on the tech sector, private tutoring, or the real estate sector would not have happened in absence of the pandemic, but the unquestionable legitimacy of COVID measures offered a window of opportunity to advance these goals. Title for the transformation from China Incorporated to CCP Incorporated. Xi Jinping economic thought did not emerge by design but evolved in response to weak spots in the domestic economy and shifts in the external environment, marked by confrontation with the U.S., all of which empowered Xi Jinping's vision for the economy. The CCP seeks to increasingly dominate the economic system just like the political system. It uses strategic guidance to contain misguided market decisions that increase financial risks and fail to advance strategic objectives or de-risk from the West. Economic policy is becoming more problem-oriented, preparing the nation for difficulties ahead. One priority is to re-establish the party's leadership in China's modernization efforts and foster the securitization of everything. This has allowed the CCP to reach into the private sector, which in Xi Jinping's view has become detached from national interests and has contributed to systemic risks in the financial sector. As a result, some of China's most successful and celebrated private companies found themselves up against a wall. First, a deleveraging campaign launched in 2016 targeted highly indebted companies, especially in the real estate and property sectors, which had contributed to excessive debt and risks to the financial system. While SOEs were also targeted in an effort to improve their performance, regulators started to focus on private companies including the rapidly expanding industrial conglomerate HNA Group and Onbuying Insurance Group in 2017. The companies have since ended in bankruptcy or become defunct with their founders imprisoned. Some of the most successful companies and entrepreneurs were increasingly seen as rivals to the CCP's grip on power. Most prominent was the halting of the world's largest IPO in 2020, Ant Financial, after founder Jack Ma made comments challenging the state-dominated banking system. His subsequent de facto silencing sent a signal to other entrepreneurs about who was in charge, which was combined with a broader crackdown on tech firms accused of disorderly expansion of capital. This meant they had done so well that too much capital was flowing their way at the expense of investment in areas designated by Beijing. This can be seen as a follow-up to Xi Jinping's first anti-corruption campaign targeting officials. But this time, the CCP targeted the private sector and entrepreneurs to force their alignment with the ideological and political goals of the party state. While not a return to a command economy through state takeovers of private firms, it is a new model that raises party interests above both the state and the private sector, thus advancing the transformation from China Incorporated to CCP Incorporated. Title 5 All economic actors must advance strategic goals. Xi Jinping's economic vision has expanded over the years. His elevation of the party is a remarkable shift in China's political economy. Hu Jintao once tried to rein in state-owned enterprises that had wandered from their core industries but failed due to vested interests. Even the People's Liberation Army, PLA, was notorious prior to Xi Jinping for its wide array of investments in the private sector. Leveraging ideology, Xi Jinping managed not only to rein in SOEs and get the PLA to divest, but expanded the CCP's control over private companies. Xi Jinping's tenure in office began with a clear continuation of Hu Jintao's dual-pillar economic model. POEs were responsible for growth and innovation, SOEs were responsible for stability and intervention. The extent of party involvement depends largely on two factors. First, the strategic relevance of a given firm. This spans from the most strategically important firms on one end, the tech gap closers that help overcome China's technological deficit in relation to liberal market economies, to the strategically important, though less critical high-value development drivers that are the new areas of growth that help China climb global value chains, and also to the least strategically relevant, though still important, economic baseline holders that fulfill the roles of maintaining employment, managing logistics and traditional infrastructure, and even to those sectors viewed with hostility from Beijing. Second, the degree of party-state control/guidance, which operates on a scale from high to low. This is reflected in the areas in which the CCP needs to advance control to drive innovation or consolidate and advance monopolistic national champions at home and abroad, as well as the areas in which the CCP wants to have greater control, such as over digital champions that process vast quantities of consumer data, or in the sectors Beijing wants to suppress for political reasons, such as the gaming industry and private tutoring, see Exhibit 6. This shift from a division of labor in which SOEs had certain roles and POEs had others to one based not on ownership type but on the strategic relevance and degree of control over individual actors creates many niche roles that companies can occupy in Xi Jinping's new economic model. Chapter 3: The Party State's Emerging Toolkit Gets Companies in Line. On the surface, it might seem the market reform process is advancing, if not even accelerating. Xi Jinping rhetorically supports the decisive role of the market, and he and his cadres often repeat the line that private firms provide 50% of tax revenue, 60% of GDP, 70% of innovation, and 80% of urban employment. The share of private companies in key sectors and their presence in the top 100 companies has steadily increased. 16 China's financial markets have also become more sophisticated. Private companies are omnipresent and financial markets have adjusted to serve the needs of these innovation drivers. Over the past 15 years, stock exchanges like Chinext, 2009, Star Market, 2019, and the Beijing Stock Market, 2021, were launched to provide funding for the country's fast-growing companies that were not adequately served by the state-owned banking system. Venture capital also grew alongside new investment channels for foreigners, such as the Stock Connect mechanism, which allows participation in Chinese capital markets like Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. Today, such market reforms are not being rolled back, but the function and scope of prices determining economic activities has become far more restrictive. Prices as a coordinating mechanism fluctuate within a lower and upper band in which the government is comfortable, similar to the managed exchange rate of the renminbi, RMB. Sudden and rapid changes increasingly trigger a policy response to correct the market. Faced with increasing capital outflow pressure from a depreciating exchange rate, the People's Bank of China, PBOC, introduced an opaque counter-cyclical factor, an adjustment to daily yuan quotes by the central bank, to help guide the market. Another prominent example was the heavy-handed government intervention during the stock market crash in 2015 or interventions to manage commodity prices in 2021. With increasing levels of intervention, prices are losing their significance as a regulator in the economy. Increasingly, the CCP is the deciding factor determining levels of supply, production, and investment. Title 111 isn't unwinding earlier reforms, but is giving the CCP a stronger role. As private companies have gained a foothold in strategically relevant sectors, the CCP has had to develop a new disciplinary system and incentive structure to compel rent-seeking entrepreneurs to serve the party's interests. This was done in part by regulatory intervention in previously largely unregulated sectors. To increase political and operational control over private companies, regulatory measures have been complemented by stronger party affiliation of the management and traditional economic guidance tools via the state-controlled financial system. As the structure of the economy has changed, the party state has supplemented its toolkit, turning increasingly to the private sector to achieve ambitious national priorities. As demonstrated with Alibaba, Beijing is using this growing set of policies, regulations, and informal instruments to reshape economic actors that do not align with strategic goals, or to direct support and guidance to firms that are generally on board. These new tools fall broadly into three categories: ownership/governance, sticks, and carrots. These are discussed briefly here but are illustrated in detailed case studies at the end of this report. Ownership/governance: direct ownership, mixed ownership/reverse mixed ownership, golden shares, party roles in decision-making, market access restrictions, vertically integrated value chains, facilitated investment/divestment. Ownership/governance tools give Beijing direct influence in the decision-making processes of economic actors. Some of this happens through traditional means like direct ownership of SOEs at the central or even local level of the government, or through market access restrictions that have historically forced foreign private companies into joint ventures, JVs, with, often state-owned, local partners, thus creating channels for the party state to guide decisions. Others are the result of more recent efforts like mixed ownership reform efforts that in many ways tied SOEs and private companies together, or the application of golden shares in certain companies to ensure the party state has certain veto powers. Finally, the party state has other unique means to intervene, such as through party roles of board members, the ability to facilitate investment or divestment, to offload toxic assets from firms like the troubled real estate behemoth Evergrande, or to raise funds through rapid sales like tech giant Huawei did with its Honor smartphone brand, or the ability of the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, SASAC, to use its ownership of multiple SOEs in a given value chain to coordinate action. STIC's regulatory direction crackdowns and rectifications IPO blocks common prosperity demands assignment to national teams. STICs in Beijing's arsenal give it the means to drive unruly actors away from the things Beijing doesn't include in its objectives. This can happen through traditional regulatory direction, both to drive legitimate compliance, like with the new cyber and data legal regime, or as means of political signaling through crackdowns and rectification campaigns, like choosing the internet platform sector for its first round of cyber and data rules enforcement to send a message to other industries. This can also include steps like scuttling planned IPOs at the political direction of Xi Jinping himself. Some STICs don't look so offensive or damaging, but instead are means of atonement, like embracing common prosperity by putting billions into common prosperity funds or joining national teams to help close strategic technology gaps. Carrots direct subsidies / tax relief policy banks cheap loans advantageous stock listings implicit guarantees state guidance funds little giant status HNT status insured customer base R&D support protected home market carrots are a way for Beijing to direct support to economic actors already aligned with national goals to help facilitate their success. They include many traditional means of state aid like subsidies, tax relief, cheap loans from state-run commercial and policy banks, implicit guarantees for SOEs, and protection from foreign competition. However, new support mechanisms have emerged in recent years to help achieve strategic goals, especially those related to closing the tech gap, advantageous stock listings in tech and SME-specific markets, state guidance funds, status as a little giant, small firms in important areas of development, or as a high and new technology enterprise. Insured customer bases through public procurement or support from SOE customers, and extensive support in R&D through China's innovation chain strategy. Title II The growing cast of roles for POI's economic policies increasingly focus on private enterprises, particularly high-tech small and mid-size enterprises, SMEs, as key actors to solve core issues like technological bottlenecks and economic self-reliance, see Exhibit 7. The tech sector has benefited from walled gardens protecting them against foreign competition. Now that they have blossomed into strategically relevant companies, the CCP is beginning to tighten its grip. Private firms' increasing prominence in policies also entails greater party-state guidance to focus on core objectives, see Exhibit 8. Prominent cadres call on private enterprises to continuously increase S&T innovation efforts and to strive to become the force to solve the bottleneck technology problem. The government understands that private firms often have the dynamism and creativity that SOEs lack to innovate and commercialize emerging technologies, which are key ingredients for China's new development agenda. The greater guidance of private enterprises is accompanied by new carrots and sticks. If private companies follow party-state guidance, they stand to benefit from direct and indirect policy support and improved financing options. A top-level policy published in 2019 by the CCPCC and the State Council is directed at improving the business environment and financing options for private firms to harness their innovation for national goals. Furthermore, the party has greater expectations of the private sector to fulfill national priorities and unswervingly listen to and follow the party at all times. This does not mean that all companies are tightly controlled by the party state, far from it. The bulk of private firms fall outside of the areas deemed strategically relevant by Beijing. Even in some important industries like the new energy vehicle (NEV) sector, which is critical for China's green transition and is also an important growth sector where Chinese firms are on the cutting edge, the party state has given considerable space to private actors. It has adopted a surprisingly lax approach to directing NEV makers while also throwing mountains of state aid into the sector to drive up demand, effectively dedicating a large field where contenders could take root with ample fertilizer for all. Only after some NEV makers emerged as commercially viable did Beijing begin to tighten standards and cut off state aid, eventually leading the weakest players to exit the field and leave the remaining space to China's most promising NEV brands. Since at least the 2013 third plenum, the leadership has been optimizing economic policies in order to establish a more efficient economic system, driven in part by market forces, that also responds to the guidance of the party. Xi Jinping recognizes the superiority of a competitive environment in allocating economic resources in terms of market efficiency for the purposes of growth and general development. However, in areas where investment would not be efficient from a market perspective, but where the leadership urgently needs China to be technologically competitive on a global scale, party-state intervention is essential. From the perspective of the CCP, this is not seen as a contradiction. In Xi Jinping's era, the share of POE in China's fixed asset investment has deteriorated by nearly 10 percentage points. Despite these notable shifts, China is not a command economy in which all companies follow the party overlord by investing in the real economy. The deterioration of POE investment is mainly due to a slowdown in services and real estate, while investment in manufacturing has been growing in the double digits. But the private sector remains fairly reluctant to follow the CCP's growing influence, requiring the CCP to develop new tools for control and guidance. Private companies continue to have similar opportunities as in far more capitalistic systems. But market mechanisms, including how private companies and financial markets operate, are increasingly guided, if not dominated, by the CCP. All in all, the CCP is trying to come up with a system of economic rules that forcefully merges party control with market mechanisms. Chapter 4: Beijing advances technological self-reliance by all means. Xi Jinping's geopolitically focused political economy is on full display in the way innovation is being pursued in China, as well as how the country's innovation dividend is materializing. Considering the remarkable progress that China has made in advancing itself as a technological great power, there would normally be an expectation that total factor productivity would have climbed as the returns on innovation gains kick in. Instead, total factor productivity has trended downward, begging the question of where the dividend has gone. Rather than going towards productivity, much of it has gone towards Xi Jinping's tech self-reliance goals. This is because in most technologies, China is playing catch-up in terms of tech effectiveness, but it has enjoyed extensive access to foreign technology. In previous years, Chinese firms could simply acquire the foreign technology to maximize their return, which could bring productivity growth. Instead, Xi Jinping has set the country on a path where, in many key areas, it is more important that companies expensively develop the tech themselves. Had China instead focused on its own comparative advantages and accepted interdependencies on others in areas where it lagged, the innovation dividend would likely have moved the needle up on productivity, but instead, it has only gone to closing tech gaps, see Exhibit 9. The tech self-reliance priority has now been cemented in place. Now facing a showdown with the US and its allies, Xi Jinping has called for a new type of whole-of-nation approach in the 2020 Central Economic Work Conference to close technology gaps and rid China of its dependency on the foreign actors he believes intend to contain his country. Several clear patterns in these efforts have emerged in the national strategy. First, closing gaps across as many strategic technologies as possible. Second, in strategic technologies where China has achieved effective competitiveness, protecting market share from foreign competition so indigenous firms can achieve market efficiency. Third, in strategic technologies where China remains far behind, attracting foreign investment where possible and continuing to import from abroad where necessary. Title I: Innovate Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. In an attempt to better align innovation and industry, the CCP is setting up new hierarchies within the economy. By mixing tested methods with a stronger embrace of technocratic laboratory capitalism, a form of capitalism that operates in a highly controlled environment, the CCP aims to increase centralization and coordination of economic actors. While higher levels of political control may hinder innovation of privately owned companies, the CCP is also attempting to integrate them into China's evolving innovation ecosystem, including networking them with national research institutions, universities, and other companies. The government has also recognized the private sector's strength in emerging technology and incentivizes technology development and competition by reducing their financial risk. The new type of centralized administration of innovation aims to accelerate innovation in strategic areas by aligning the private and state sectors in pursuing national strategic targets. Ministries and relevant departments play a crucial role in developing the required plans, including roadmaps, timetables, and responsibilities. The plans set the framework for direct and indirect financial incentives that help steer market actors toward the most efficient way to reach targets. In sectors where POEs dominate, they compete for full government support, currently especially seen in semiconductors, but previously for electric vehicles, EVs. Likewise, in sectors where SOEs dominate, they are expected to help reach goals by transforming themselves into profitable drivers of innovation. This is consistent with the emphasis on POEs and SOEs as pillars of the Chinese economy outlined in the 2013 Third Plenum. Increasingly, both are operating in a similar environment, with the CCP exerting control over their operational direction regardless of their ownership. Yet, it is not simply down to POEs and SOEs to contribute to the leadership's call for innovation. In line with the whole-of-nation approach, Beijing has been refining its approach to bringing the party-state and the scientific community in at early stages and then fostering commercialization at the corporate end of China's innovation chain. The intention of the innovation chain is to centralize and streamline everything from the earliest basic research to eventual commercialization, first in terms of tech effectiveness and then market efficiency, all with the party-state guiding and supporting each actor along the way. Encapsulating the whole-of-nation approach is the role that larger POEs and SOEs are also meant to play in the innovation chain. This includes expectations that they support the scientific community in the research phase, and often also invest either in their own subsidiaries, which then benefit from tech transfer, or in startups, providing much-needed capital and business support. For China's startups seen as having the potential to close the technology gap in key areas, that support can also come through China's Little Giants initiative. Little Giants provides extensive support to qualifying SMEs through the innovation chain model and by connecting them with financial markets like the Beijing stock market. See the case study on the Little Giant Company Leader Drive at the end of this chapter. In 2022, 40% of listings on the Shanghai, Shenzhen and Beijing stock exchanges were made by Little Giant companies. Title II: Taking indigenous champions from tech effectiveness to market efficiency. As innovation is often a contest of incremental improvements, technology that is one or two steps behind the cutting edge can still achieve much of what its most advanced version can. An EV with a range of 200 kilometers can fulfill most of the same needs of commuter drivers as an EV with a range of 300 kilometers. And a chip made with the 22 nanometers process can achieve in a smartphone much, but certainly not all, of the same functionality as a 14 nanometers version. Even if the more advanced tech can do some things its lesser version cannot, there is still enough overlap to satisfy many customers. Obviously, Beijing would like to be on the cutting edge in many technologies, but it will often settle first for getting close enough to produce most of the desired applications of a given tech. This tried-and-true formula has been demonstrated most clearly in the area of high-speed rail, HSR, technology. China's ambition to create an HSR network was hampered by a lack of expertise and technology to build domestic models. Foreign HSR companies were invited into the market and required to enter JVs and transfer technology to local players such as Northern and Southern rolling stock companies CNR and CSR. Brands like Kawasaki, Alstom, Siemens and Bombardier all jumped into the market hoping to become the dominant players. Over time, CNR and CSR merged into a single monopolistic giant CRRC, which then had access to all of the transferred foreign tech and eventually caught up and managed to produce technologically effective alternatives to the foreign brands. It didn't take long for the procurement system in charge of purchasing engines and rolling stock to favor CRRC over its foreign competitors, effectively pushing them out of the market aside from some niche tech related to HSR. Since then, China's HSR network has dwarfed all others. Anyone who has ridden the CRRC Fuxing National Rejuvenation Line, which is the exclusive intellectual property of CRRC, can tell you how its speed and smooth ride make European high-speed rail feel outdated. A similar story is currently playing out with Huawei, which has overtaken its rivals in 5G technology and now enjoys a protected home market to build out almost entirely without foreign competition. Beyond that, Huawei is central to Beijing's strategic ambition to close other technology gaps, and the company is covered in a case study at the end of this chapter. Some of the same rules that are benefiting Huawei as sources of protection in its home market are also applicable to other sectors. Xi Jinping's ambition to securitize China in every possible way has created regulatory and other means to drive out undesirable foreign competition in certain industries, but also to compel the rest of the foreign business community and local firms to integrate with indigenous tech in affected areas. This is happening most sharply in the critical information infrastructure (CII) space, where suppliers of relevant information communications technology (ICT) and digital solutions must be whitelisted by a multitude of government bodies for customers designated as CII operators. The rules have a massive negative impact on foreign suppliers and operators. The former report to the European Chamber of Commerce that they face far higher levels of scrutiny than their local competitors, while the latter say they often need to gut their hardware and software used globally and furnish their China operations with indigenous solutions. A less deep-cutting, but more widespread, source of protectionism is the Autonomous and Controllable ANC campaign, which aims to ensure value chains that can go it alone if needed. Importantly, as more and more industries undergo digitalization and rely more on networking and automation, there is a higher likelihood they will fall under greater scrutiny as operators. It is hard to imagine that Beijing will allow highly automated chemical plants, in a country with a history of exploding chemical plants, or autonomous vehicles to operate without much more oversight and intervention from authorities. Title 3: Drawing in foreign tech where possible, importing it where necessary. It is impossible to talk about China's own tech self-reliance ambitions without also covering the very dependencies on foreign technologies it seeks to remedy. Where China remains too far behind foreign technology providers, it approaches self-reliance through opening up. The onshoring of foreign technology brings the tech within China's borders and under Beijing's jurisdiction, a much preferred choice to importing it and being subject to potential restrictions from the US or elsewhere. This can mean removing restrictions, but also rolling out the red carpet with additional support measures to incentivize onshoring. While a variety of external restrictions make it impossible, Beijing would eagerly provide abundant support to companies on the cutting edge in the semiconductor value chain. Firms like TSMC, ASML, Nikon, and Intel could effectively name their price if they onshored their most advanced production. A similar situation emerged for foreign chemical makers BASF and ExxonMobil when they each announced plans in 2018 to build plants valued at $10 billion in Guangdong. These chemical plants will produce highly advanced chemicals for customers in China that previously would have been imported, which would potentially have subjected them to disruption. To facilitate this investment, Beijing approved 100% foreign ownership for each investment, something that had never before happened in China. Finally, China will reluctantly continue to import foreign technology where it has no other choice, though it will simultaneously focus efforts on closing the tech gap in these areas. This is most widely the case in the semiconductor space, where China must import the most cutting-edge chips that empower its own innovation system and its exports, albeit with much greater difficulty since the October 2022 restrictions on U.S. chip tech and the early 2023 joint agreement of the U.S., Japan, and the Netherlands to restrict exports of the most advanced lithography machines. However, this applies to far more technologies than Beijing would like. Just to name a few, due to their status as military contractors in the US and Europe, many of Airbus and Boeing suppliers are only allowed to export certain components to Chinese passenger airliner Aspirin Comac. A multitude of European and Japanese industrial machinery makers will only export their most cutting-edge products to China. Legions of hidden champions / so-called middle-stand firms that fill niche roles as the primary, or even sole, providers of certain components have the luxury of a seller's market and are under no pressure to onshore. Title 4: Seeking tech supremacy, China has used dominance in manufacturing and raw materials as leverage. In one of his signature speeches, Some Major Problems Facing Medium to Long-Term National Economic and Social Development, published in Qiushi, the CCP's theory journal, in late 2020, but originally delivered in April 2020, Xi Jinping expounded on his vision for China that was very technology-centric. Coming out of the intense initial lockdowns at the start of the pandemic, the speech called first for a resilient domestic market to decrease reliance on foreign demand and second for localized value chains and secure technology access. One plank for achieving secure technology access is by catching up and overtaking the technological high ground so that Beijing will have deterrence through a sort of technological mutually assured destruction position. Specifically, Xi Jinping envisions Assassin's Mace Technologies, the Chinese equivalent of a trump card, something which can be unexpectedly thrown into a contest or a fight that changes the dynamic. The ambition is to establish China as the dominant tech supplier for an emerging technology that will be in high demand globally. From that position, Beijing would control its own tech bottleneck, which it could credibly use against other markets, much in the way Washington uses the semiconductor bottleneck to gain a hold on China. The effect would be deterrence, so the US would think twice about cutting China off from its chip technology lest China cut the US off from its bottleneck technology. This could be in AI, quantum computing, life sciences, or new materials, anything China is currently on the edge of and which could become critical in empowering not just one or two end products, but multiple value chains, and a country's innovative capacity itself. For now, that also means other technologies that can drive deterrence. Beijing's early 2023 crafting of restrictions on outbound intellectual property related to photovoltaic, solar panels, tech opens the door to a kind of export control over a key technology for the green transition, and one where China holds around 80% of the global market share in the full value chain for solar panels. Meanwhile, on July 3, 2023, China's Ministry of Commerce announced export controls on gallium and germanium-related materials on the grounds that they have dual-use applications. China produces around two-thirds of the world's germanium and 97% of its gallium, with each mineral being the base for a variety of applications in semiconductor, optics, and electronics more generally. This came after the Netherlands announced details of its own restrictions on exports of cutting-edge lithography machines aligned with the US and Japan. Beijing clearly had prepared its own response and kept it ready to play at the right moment as a possible deterrent. Gallium, for example, is essential for cutting-edge chip wafers made by Japanese firms, used by Korean and Taiwanese chipmakers, all made with Japanese and Dutch lithography machines. Chapter 5: Xi Jinping's emerging social contract puts strategic objectives first. China's economic transition has been a remarkable success. In the process, over 800 million people have escaped poverty. Just in time for the CCP's centennial in 2021, Xi Jinping declared the end of extreme poverty. The annual income of at least 100 million people had exceeded 4,000 renminbi, China's definition as the rural poverty line. In 2022, GDP per capita reached $12,720, putting it close to the World Bank's definition of a high-income country of $13,845.59, but this still leaves China below Bulgaria, $13,772, and Romania, $15,892, the countries with the lowest GDP per capita in the EU. Solely focusing on national GDP per capita levels in China might be misleading as it is already an innovation power to reckon with. In a large economy like China, various development stages take place simultaneously. Already 42% of its population lives in regions that would be categorized as high income by the World Bank. Jiangsu, Fujian, Zhejiang and Guangdong all have a GDP per capita greater than $15,000 in 2022. Together, their population is over 330 million, giving China a very sizable middle class. Despite this remarkable success in improving the well-being of society, China's economic policies have remained geared toward supporting industry in pursuit of greater technological sophistication. Reaching national strategic goals requires large capital investments in infrastructure, production capacity, and science and innovation. Empowering the autonomy of private households' consumption patterns is not compatible in a system that seeks greater centralization and control. After all, consumers might not buy what the party wants them to. This sets limits to the decade-old demands for rebalancing the economy to rely less on investment. In Xi Jinping's economic logic, it is a strong capacity to provide effective supply that creates jobs and income, and from that follows demand. The type of socialism that Xi Jinping envisions for China emphasizes ideology and nationalism. A fundamental part of this are collectivist principles as an important feature of China's economic system. This means that the nation's interest supersedes that of the individual. While individuals are not yet only seen as a means to an end by the CCP, more repressive structures in the political economy are limiting their corridors of economic activity. Advancing authoritarian elements as a key principle of governance under the leadership of Xi Jinping is leaving its marks on the socio-economic structure of the country. As in other parts of China's economy, the CCP is advancing its position and guidance over economic actors. This does not bode well for a substantial shift in China's growth model toward more household consumption and has significant implications for China's development path. Title I: Consumption-driven growth fails to lift OFF. One of Xi Jinping's signature policy agendas, the dual circulation strategy, is centered around just that. The core principle is to shift China from its previous model of export and investment-driven growth to one that is primarily fueled by domestic consumption, and in which exports play a supplementary role. However, broad acknowledgement that such a shift toward consumption-driven growth is necessary does not inherently facilitate that transition. There are other priorities to consider, and Xi Jinping has clearly ranked consumption-driven growth as a second-tier goal. Countries with higher government control over the economy have generally lower degrees of private consumption. The household consumption share of GDP has barely improved since Xi Jinping's first term in 2013, going from 34.3% in 2010 to 38.5% in 2021, basically the same level over the past 5 years. Despite a long debate on the transition to a more sustainable growth model, investment remains the most important element in the economy. This should not come as a surprise, as achieving industrial policy objectives takes precedence over advancing socio-economic targets. A higher share of consumption and the autonomy of households would counter efforts toward greater centralization of China's economic system favoring industrial policy, see Exhibit 11. The household consumption share of GDP for countries classified as middle income by the World Bank is typically around 50%, while for high-income countries the share is around 60%. In isolation, the failure of the dual circulation strategy to drive change might suggest a policy failure, but in the broader context of Xi Jinping's economic policymaking, it is rather a failure caused by trade-offs. From the perspective of Xi Jinping's economic thought, however, a low household consumption share should be understood as a feature of China's economic system rather than a structural problem. Title II: The Rebuttal of the Welfare State. Socioeconomic indicators stagnate under 11. Advancing socioeconomic policies and redistribution have not been the mainstay of the CCP since it embarked on economic reforms, and are not under Xi Jinping either. Xu Rongji ended the Mao-era social safety net of the company-level work unit during the reform of SOEs in the 1990s. Disbanding the Iron Rice Bowl was replaced by a laissez-faire social system akin to a neoliberal economy. Any substantial rebalancing effort would require a meaningful redistribution and increased social expenditure by the government, which would come at the expense of investments in expanding manufacturing capabilities and innovation. This requires change to be institutionalized rather than a campaign-style approach such as battling extreme poverty. These priorities are unlikely to change anytime soon under Xi Jinping despite ambitious social reforms announced in 2013. Public spending on health, education, social security, and employment largely remained unchanged in Xi Jinping's first 2 terms, reaching 8.1% in 2022. Xi Jinping has inherited many of the problems of previous leaders, but despite some lip service to structural reform, he continues to kick the can down the road. Addressing these long-lasting structural issues will become even more pressing as GDP growth slows, society ages, and the working population shrinks further from its peak in 2015, and highly leveraged local governments struggle to fund social services, see Exhibit 12. The lack of a proper social safety net helps explain China's exceptionally high savings rate. Households save money for healthcare or retirement rather than consume. High saving rates in turn promote an investment-led growth model as it facilitates cheap capital. Savings as a share of GDP have held steady at levels close to 45% since 2013. China's saving rate is almost in a league of its own and far higher than for middle or high-income countries as classified by the World Bank. The impression of hyperconsumption in China's modern megacities or online retail frenzy do not reflect the macroeconomic reality but rather a snapshot of the society and entrenched inequality. China's inequality has remained persistent but has been less of a policy issue for as long as economic growth remains strong enough to improve the lives of all income groups. This has given the CCP the liberty to set economic policy priorities other than strengthening the social system, see Exhibit 13 and Exhibit 14. Title III: Common Prosperity is more symbolism than structural change. The failure to direct more income to households belies another core tenet of Xi Jinping's economic ideology in practice. Common prosperity re-entered the lexicon in 2021 when it was wielded alongside the broader crackdowns on digital tech and real estate. Many initially expected that large-scale redistribution was in store, but this failed to materialize beyond some talk of tertiary distribution, the redistribution from wealth via donation or charities. Companies got the message to take on more social responsibility by expanding philanthropic work, including donating to those in need and setting up funds focusing on rural development and announcing measures to reduce the income gap within companies. Under Xi Jinping, the flashy display of wealth by business elites is becoming less fashionable and potentially risky. China's entrepreneurs could be facing consequences similar to local officials during the anti-corruption campaign in the early days of Xi Jinping's rule. In response, officials could no longer hold fancy banquets or be seen with expensive watches. There is an increasing expectation of modesty and the need to demonstrate a role in developing the nation. As a result, China's billionaires donated a record sum of $10 billion in 2022, more than a drop in the bucket. Common prosperity has been used alongside pressure on China's most innovative companies to put their capital and expertise to use in achieving national strategic goals, like closing the technology gap. But common prosperity is not about deriving prosperity for the working class at the expense of higher taxes on the wealthy or increasing costly social services. Xi Jinping's policies, including a crackdown on private companies and elites, in part resemble populist policies introduced by disgraced former senior CCP official Bo Xilai in Chongqing, who was convicted of embezzlement, but they do not concretely address key issues including redistribution and inequality. So far, his efforts pale in comparison to those under former President Hu Jintao, who expanded labor legislation, including contract law and a more serious implementation of minimum wage and improved access to medical insurance for migrant workers, although these efforts lost steam at the end of his term in 2012. Ironically, Xi Jinping's vision of Chinese socialism comes with a rejection of Western-style socialism with its stronger role for the state. Instead of deepening institutional reforms, the responsibility of providing is left in large part to individuals themselves, while the state contribution is kept to a minimum. Stronger guidance on companies under common prosperity is little more than signaling right now, but if accelerated, could shift toward a larger burden falling directly on companies. This sentiment is also captured in the case study on Tencent at the end of this chapter. The company was front and center during the consumer internet/platform crackdowns of 2020 to 2021, and it has been pushed by Beijing to align its strengths towards supporting the real economy. Furthermore, Beijing has heavily punished the gaming side of Tencent's operations, with tight regulations not only limiting approvals for new games, but for restricting gaming time for some users. The result is that the company has been cowed domestically and is strategically going overseas to make up for the lost business opportunities within China. Title for the new social contract means contributing to national rejuvenation. Policies under Xi Jinping increasingly appear motivated by non-economic targets that do not aim to increase profits or the welfare of individuals and private companies, but rather to promote self-reliance and national power, including military power. Allocating national resources to building a welfare state is a luxury the CCP does not want to pursue in a time of growing systemic rivalry with the US. Increasingly, the economic beneficiaries of China's development in past decades, notably entrepreneurs, the wealthy and the middle class, will now be expected to be grateful to the party for allowing them to be far better off than the hard-working generations before them. The new message is, don't become complacent. Tighten your economic belts and roll up your sleeves to do what is in your power to rejuvenate the Chinese nation. Aligning national strategic priorities with jobs and income is becoming more difficult as China deals with a more demanding middle class and its needs for jobs and income. This comes as social fault lines are becoming more complex. Youth unemployment reached record levels of over 20% in Q2 2023, yet companies are struggling to fill vacancies in factories. One reason for this is a growing mismatch of skills and expectations. Workers with the vocational skills needed in manufacturing are scarce. On the other hand, not every university graduate will become a high-profile scientist helping China close the technology gap. Encouraging youth to work in the countryside seems to be a hard sell for an aspiring future generation. Most young urbanites most likely do not expect to return to rural life, nor are they keen to work in 3D manufacturing jobs, dirty, demanding, difficult. Creating a large middle class, one of China's biggest economic reform successes, now looks like a potential vulnerability for the CCP. There is a real risk that parts of society will see a stagnation, or even a possible deterioration, in economic well-being. The CCP will need to respond to these demands of the middle class. It has already shown a return to pragmatism following intense economic pressure built up during the 3-year zero-COVID policy. The CCP must control social economic risks using, for example, extensive party and state intervention in sectors like real estate, most infamously with the debt-ridden property giant Evergrande, but also to provide an economic baseline that ensures employment and income to satisfy the minimum needs of the majority of society. Beijing views the role of most companies as holding that economic baseline. This includes companies with a limited role in driving forward high value-added production or helping in the innovation drive to close key tech gaps. One example, GSE Toyota, a Sino-Japanese JV internal combustion engine automaker, is covered in the case study below. The greater importance of ideology and geopolitical rivalry are nurturing a more repressive political economy which tends to be less responsive to a moderate society. 69 Under such a system, social and regional divisions are likely to become a major issue going forward. Though more policy changes attempting to address the resulting problems can be expected in the context of common prosperity, the overall prioritization of national strategic goals over economic growth seems to be a new hallmark of China's economic system. Chapter 6 China contends for the central position in the global economy. Throughout the reform process initiated under Deng Xiaoping, China's foreign economic policies remained highly restrictive and controlled, most notably, its strict capital controls and restrictions on foreign investments. The general mantra of hedged integration with the global economy has not changed under Xi Jinping. But the parameters for China's future opening are increasingly happening on its own terms. In the process, China is reinforcing and strengthening controls over international trade and finance, in and outbound investment and the flow of data and people that make up Fortress China. It is also a reminder that the relative trade openness that has been a key driver for China's integration over the past decades is more the exception than the norm for China. Global economic integration should now be on China's terms to safeguard its national interests and long-term economic development. The objective is to create economic and technological dependencies by developing new markets, controlling value chains and securing access to key resources for China's industry, energy, and food needs. Instead of pursuing Western-style globalization driven by capitalism, China is seeking its own path consistent with greater party control and guidance. A world in which companies act independently from national strategic goals in pursuit of profitability conflicts with Xi Jinping's economic principles. National interest should take precedence over profit-driven motivations. Beijing recognizes the need for China to remain connected to the global economy to advance its development and expand global power, but is wary of unfettered, Western-style globalization. However, China is not on a path towards isolation. It is not in China's interest to completely disconnect with liberal market economies, as it still needs their markets for exports and needs its capital and technology to overcome existing tech dependencies. Providing economic incentives is also an effective tool to keep countries in line with China's interests and positions. To facilitate this, China is highly active in deepening ties with the global South as it seeks to develop new alternatives. Three key features of China's engagement with the world are challenging the existing global economic order, mitigating risks with liberal market economies, and engaging with emerging and developing countries. Challenging the global order, the leadership's efforts to strengthen China's position as a global economic power lacks neither vision nor ambition. China is doubling down in its effort to pull more and more countries and companies into its sphere of economic influence. The BRI has helped China expand its trade faster and served as a new source of external demand. Investment-driven engagement has focused on building hardware, complemented by agreements to provide the software to run it. U.S. economic sanctions and concerns that American global hegemony is waning have provided China additional inroads and growing economic clout. In response to geopolitical shifts, China has accelerated its efforts by rolling out numerous new initiatives. In 2022, it launched the trinity of the Global Development Initiative, GDI, the Global Security Instigative, GSI, and the Global Civilization Initiative, GCI. Older formats such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization formed in 2001 seem to have gained new momentum. Shifting the economic center of gravity, ideally, China should provide an alternative if not replace the dominance of liberal market economies as a global provider of technology and capital. While expanding economic ties with liberal market economies was a catalyst for China's development in the past, China is now seeking greater engagement with the global South, promoting development in these new markets to cultivate new customers for its exports. It portrays itself as the champion of the global South, which frustrated with the American-led world order that leverages the gravitational pull of its economy. In a shifting global context, China's multifaceted set of policies are finding welcome takers around the world. Develop China's own de-risking strategy. Just as voices in advanced economies say there is no second China as a market, the reality is that there is no second set of liberal market economies for China when it comes to technology, capital, and demand for Chinese exports. While it aims for autarky, China is not in a position to cut all foreign dependencies without massive implications for its own development. One way is by absorbing global value chains through greater localization of foreign companies. China has opened up many sectors to foreign investment to onshore key technology providers. Ironically, opening up in such areas advances technological self-reliance by bringing foreign technology under Beijing's jurisdiction. The globalization that has driven China's engagement with the world is undergoing a structural break, with new risks and opportunities for China to shape its own position. To understand the direction China is taking in its relationship with the rest of the world, it is critical to examine its changing patterns of trade, investment, technology, and finance. Two case studies at the end of this chapter cover how an emerging global tech leader in the EV space, BYD, as well as the old state-owned national shipping champion, COSCO, contribute to the strategic goals of Beijing at home, but especially overseas. Title 1 Trade. China wants to develop new export markets and increase dependencies on the Chinese market. Growing trade ties have long been the key driver for China's global integration. China overtook the US as the biggest trade partner of 71% of the world in 2021. Gaining access to the large Chinese market is an irresistible lure to deepen ties with China, including through new bilateral or regional trade agreements. After years of booming trade with advanced economies, export volumes are nearing saturation, but with 40% of China's exports going to the EU, US, and Japan in 2022, developing new export markets is still an uphill battle. Regional trade deals like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, are useful for Beijing to build regional supply chains and markets, especially in Southeast Asia where more geopolitically neutral countries in its immediate neighborhood are less likely to sign on to what China perceives as U.S. containment efforts. China is still heavily dependent on a few Western countries for high-tech, but also for key commodities, e.g., U.S. for soy or Australian iron ore and coal. While self-sufficiency is a feasible solution for reducing tech dependencies, diversification efforts facilitated by the BRI are a key for commodities that China lacks, e.g., Brazil for soy and iron ore. After all, no effort from Beijing will make iron ore spontaneously materialize within China's borders, see Exhibit 17. China is now focused on deepening ties with the global South. China's strategic engagement with emerging countries expanded its global economic footprint and helped to improve food security and access to raw materials, including ones critical for the energy transition. Starting December 1, 2022, China reduced trade restrictions on 9 African countries for over 8,000 items and the pursuit of trade deals in Latin America for market access and securing commodities. China has much to gain from providing better market access, especially for exports of commodities and lower value products, while competition in higher value goods with advanced economies will likely impact the trade structure. However, during a meeting of the Central Finance Committee in May 2023, it was stressed that China should not give up on low-end industry and instead transform it, as it provides an important foundation for manufacturing. China's trade structure will need to considerably change, becoming less export-driven and relying on more diversified import structures beyond commodities and high-tech. Growing trade is often accompanied with a growing trade deficit due to China's dominance in manufacturing. China has a trade deficit with only around 20 countries, all commodity exporters with the exception of South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Switzerland. But the sheer size of the Chinese market remains the government's biggest driver for deepening economic ties. For emerging economies, it provides a welcome alternative to Western markets, while for advanced economies deeper trade should act as a bridge over the growing political divide, see Exhibit 18. Title II Investment. China wants to become a key investor in emerging economies and attract high-tech investment. China has been a long-term recipient and beneficiary of foreign investment and continues to open access by trimming its negative list that restricts foreign investment in certain sectors and revising the catalog for sectors that encourage foreign investment. Slower growth prospects, geopolitical risks, and a more restrictive political environment has tarnished China's appeal for many foreign companies. Coupled with a weaker global economic outlook, foreign direct investment, FDI, in China fell to a 25-year low in the first half of 2023. FDI now more than ever is focused on helping close technological gaps and improve supply chain resilience. This means companies in high-tech sectors can expect red carpet treatment to onshore high value-added production and R&D. The importance and concern of dwindling FDI has led the State Council to release a new set of measures aimed at attracting high-quality investment in August 2023. During the last decade, China has started to establish itself as a major investor overseas. Initially, Chinese investments were focused on developing countries. The BRI, launched in 2013, and the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, AIIB, in 2015 were prominent efforts in Xi Jinping's ambition to strengthen China's position in the world. China does provide an attractive alternative for many developing countries, and one that does not tie investments to issues of human rights or environmental protection. Central elements of the BRI and the AIIB have been their emphasis on financing and infrastructure projects to meet their transportation, communication, and energy infrastructure demands in foreign countries. But there are also examples of dedicated development zones such as the Sihanoukville Special Economic Zone in Cambodia. Despite criticism of being a potential debt trap and pushback in some regions amid disappointment about delivering on pledged investments, the initiatives have yielded tangible results. China is seen as a partner for economic development for a wide range of projects from infrastructure to dealing with climate change. In developed countries, Chinese companies have also started to gain traction as an investor. In 2016, Chinese firms invested a record €47.5 billion in EU27 and the UK. However, investment has steadily slowed. In 2022, Chinese investment in Europe was only €7.9 billion, down 83% from the 2016 peak. The decline is caused by tightening capital restrictions in China to prevent investments in non-strategic areas such as football clubs or real estate, and political and regulatory pushback in the US and Europe that has made it more difficult for Chinese firms to conduct merger and acquisition (M&A) transactions, especially in critical infrastructure and technology assets. As in 2022, M&A fell to its lowest levels since 2011, €3.4 billion, record greenfield, €4.5 billion, has become new bright spot of Chinese investments in Europe, albeit fragile for now because this has targeted only a few sectors, primarily EV batteries. Despite China's surging outbound investment in the last decade, investment relations between liberal market economies, and China remain heavily uneven. While companies from those countries continue to invest heavily in China, the same is not true in the reverse. By 2021, European firms have invested an aggregated €233.6 billion in China, which is more than 3 times the amount that Chinese firms have invested in Europe, €69.9 billion. China's role as a global investor is likely to increase, but will be met with more competition as liberal market economies roll out new development projects in response to the BRI. The investment structure will need to shift more from infrastructure and M&A to greenfield investments, increasing the international exposure of Chinese companies. As of now, China's investment in manufacturing in ASEAN, for example, significantly lags those of the US, EU, or Japan. See Exhibit 19. Title III Technology. China wants to expand its footprint to become a global provider. China can still tap into global know-how via its overseas students or by acquiring crucial licenses. For example, the MCCI subindex on intellectual property rights, IPR, imports reached 0.52 in 2020, indicating a high level of integration. Access to foreign IPR is essential for China to continue to expand its industrial capabilities. But China has already evolved into a viable provider for technology, issuing IPR of its own, with strong growth since 2017, see Exhibit 20. Companies from Huawei to Xiaomi are household names in the area of consumer electronics. Chinese companies can provide a wide range of products from 5G networks to high-speed railway systems and energy solutions, including green tech. Xi Jinping's visit to Saudi Arabia in December 2022 was a demonstration of China's attractiveness as a development partner. The deal signed included commitments on developing hydrogen energy, data centers, and EV factories in Saudi Arabia. Digital companies have expanded their footprint as technology providers from artificial intelligence, e-commerce, and mobile payment applications to communication, smart cities, and surveillance equipment. In November 2022 alone, China completed e-commerce agreements with Laos, Thailand, Singapore, and Pakistan. See Exhibit 20. China's growing technological clout is a result of its improved innovation capacity. High-tech companies in liberal market economies now consider it essential to be part of the Chinese innovation ecosystem by expanding R&D capacity to safeguard their global competitiveness. It is an indispensable location for foreign companies, especially in dynamic sectors like digital applications, smart manufacturing, and electric/autonomous vehicles. China will leverage its growth potential and improved position in the high-tech sector to make it an irresistible market for high-tech companies. Maintaining access to technology remains vital for China's future ability to innovate. China is successfully engaging abroad to help create demand for Chinese technology. While its engagement in emerging countries is more focused on government-to-government relations, China is increasingly building on ties to companies in liberal market economies. In an attempt to tie them into China's innovation system, they hope to make international access to technology more resilient. Title IV Finance. China wants to provide an alternative to the USD-dominated financial system. After years of promises and the opening of China's financial markets in theory, real capital flows are now materializing. Strict capital controls remain in place, but China has expanded existing channels and introduced new ones to connect, e.g., Hong Kong Stock Connect or the Shanghai-London Stock Connect, its financial markets with the world. While in the past financial integration was mostly a one-way street with Chinese purchasing equities, including of Chinese companies listed abroad, and bonds, including U.S. treasuries, the picture is now becoming more balanced. The sophistication and complexity of China's financial system has greatly improved, creating an additional pull for foreign investors to participate. This includes issuing CNY-denominated bonds in China and expanding offshore financial markets. Existing capital account restrictions and growing political risks are likely to keep liberal market economies' investors underinvested in China relative to its share in the global economy. But gradual financial integration is likely to remain a key driver for China's global economic ties as it provides alternatives for advanced and emerging economies alike. China is also actively trying to break USD dominance in global trade settlement. New hope rests on the introduction of the eCNY, the box digital currency, as well as chips, the alternative to the current global payment system SWIFT. For Russia, this has provided a helpful alternative, as the Chinese currency was used for 17.9% of settlements in 2021, up from 3.1% in 2014. In 2023, agreements with Saudi Arabia, Argentina, and Brazil aim to increase use of the CNY for trade with China, e.g., via swap agreements between the central banks. The CNY's internationalization will likely accelerate but with limitations, as this would require China to give up its strict capital account controls. The emphasis on infrastructure-driven investment has also turned China into a major loan provider, providing $450 billion in net lending as of 2020, see Exhibit 21. Consistent with its narrative of championing the Global South, most of the lending has gone to developing countries. As a major lender, China can project more financial might, but it is also not risk-free. Debt defaults pose a substantial external risk to its financial system. Chapter 7 Beijing struggles to balance economy and ideology. Over the past decade, Xi Jinping was able to progressively expand his own vision for China's economic system by reconfiguring it with the ideological principles outlined in the previous chapters. In 2023, the economy is, again, under much stronger guidance of the party, and economic policymaking is beset by growing distrust of liberal market economies. The implementation of Xi Jinping's economic priorities are in full swing in pursuit of achieving the 2049 vision of the Great Rejuvenation. But clearly it is not all smooth sailing, and Xi Jinping's third term looks to be off to a rocky start. It is becoming inherently difficult to reconcile economic interests with political ones, and it is becoming obvious that pursuing geopolitical priorities comes with a price on the economy. The expectations of a swift return to pre-pandemic consumption patterns within Chinese households have been thwarted while private companies are struggling. It seems as if the leadership underestimated the profound impact of the confluence of factors from zero COVID, the crackdown on the dynamic tech sector and real estate, as well as rising geopolitical risks. As the economy is absorbing the policy medicine the party state prescribed, it is causing side effects for the different actors. Society, after decades of improvement in livelihood, the outlook is changing for some. There is a risk of parts of China's youth being part of the first generation since the start of the reform process that sees its development stall. Record levels of youth unemployment and poor wage prospects have resulted in growing disillusion. While growing nationalism might counter this to some extent, accepting hardship for the greater good of the nation will be a difficult sell for many. Bureaucracy, compared to the start of Xi Jinping's first term, party and government officials are operating in a very different ecosystem. The anti-corruption campaigns, the return of ideology, and increasingly top-down and campaign-style approach to policymaking have diminished the incentives for policymaking experimentation at the local level. Officials that must do their job while wearing their political hats will likely continue to decide that doing what is ideologically right is more important than what might actually work in their ecosystem, or worse yet, that they will choose inaction out of fear that the consequences of any steps they take will yield the wrong results. Chinese companies, many private companies, are at odds with the direction of economic policies, while without doubt some companies also flourish as they fully embrace the priorities. There is a real risk of many highly innovative and productive economic actors choosing to hold their heads down by not being willing to take on entrepreneurial risk if the prospects of returns are limited, if they are not aligned with the strategic priorities of the party. Similarly, the many export-oriented SMEs that have thrived over the past decades serving liberal market economies might also be at odds with politics increasingly getting in the way of business. Foreign companies, lower growth prospects and changing market environment are forcing foreign companies to make strategic adjustments on how they position themselves in the Chinese market. Many need to strike a balance between de-risking and localization in a way that does not undermine their competitive position. While China continues to court foreign companies, especially in technological areas it needs, companies are increasingly at risk of being caught up in opaque national security regulations or punished for actions of their home government. Title I recent economic policy adjustments do not mark a return to more liberal economic policies. In response to the struggling economy, the party released a range of policies aimed at alleviating concerns of private and foreign companies as well as households over the summer of 2023. They seem to be geared towards alleviating concerns over the direction of the economic system. Some of the most noticeable measures include, July 14, 2023, on the private sector, opinions of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the State Council on promoting the development and growth of the private economy. 109 July 31, 2023, on consumption. The General Office of the State Council forwards the notice of the National Development and Reform Commission on measures to restore and expand consumption, August 13, 2023, on foreign investment, opinions of the State Council on further optimizing the foreign investment environment and enhancing the attraction of foreign investment, September 4, 2023, on the private sector, Private Economic Development Bureau by the National Reform and Development Commission, NDRC, is newly established. The policies embrace fair competition, market-oriented restructuring, stronger rule of law, efforts to boost consumption as well as more opportunities for foreign companies. Such measures are a recognition of how implementing Xi Jinping's the party's economic principles has affected sentiment of the private sector and households. The efforts to shore up economic growth revive more reformist language and contrast the efforts aimed at strengthening party oversight. However, the oft-billed pragmatism of such measures and language are not yet likely to be indicative of a sea change in Xi Jinping's approach to economic governance. Rather, these steps are matters of tone and timing. As the third plenum approaches, more such language can be expected for as long as China's economy continues to struggle. In an effort to improve business sentiment, the importance of markets and openness will be stressed. The aim is to soften the impact that economic actors are feeling as they settle into the new normal of Xi Jinping's geopolitically focused political economy. But akin to what was said in the 2013 Third Plenum, the words need to be seen in the larger context of Xi Jinping's visions for the country and the role the party has in it. The policy direction set during the third plenum will be a test and an opportunity to evaluate the attempt on how the leadership tries to reconcile trade-offs between strategic priorities and sufficient economic growth. At the moment, the adjustments are more symbolic than substantive. A meaningful shift of policy direction would likely demand far more economic and social pressure. Nevertheless, the recent measures to reinforce the private sector are reminders that the leadership is not immune to market sentiment and that the party struggles to sell its policy objectives to all its subjects. Success, of course, is not certain. There is the risk that the ideological streamlining of the economy fails, forcing for more substantial policy adjustments in the future. But for now, the overall direction is rigorously following the path Xi Jinping has set out over the past 10 years. Even in times of lower growth, it seems more likely that Xi Jinping will force his vision on economic actors and limit any adjustments to minor concessions. The events currently unfolding might be as impactful as China's integration into the world economy in the early 2000s. But the economic and geopolitical context has dramatically shifted from integration to competition, if not conflict, with liberal market economies. China's future reforms and opening must be seen in the context of Xi Jinping's strategy for its next stage of development. Instead of again engaging in wishful thinking about China's development path as was done in 2013, Europe and other liberal market economies will need to accept the systemic differences and work out a pathway for mutual existence that includes accepting the systemic challenge and preparing for competition. Dealing with China and the structural break of today's globalization should be seen as a wake-up call for Europe. It presents an opportunity and will require the courage to break through decades-old thinking. Policymakers in corporate boardrooms continue to take a defensive posture as they face the dilemma of responding to a changing China. European policy is focused on measures to defend the common market from distortions from and dependencies on China, while C-suite discussions are about how to defend their footprint in the China market. All actors would do well to adopt more offensive postures that coolly calculate what will be necessary to compete with China in third markets. For corporations, that means assertive strategies to secure market share in third markets and to wrestle with increasingly advanced competitors. For policymakers, that means strengthening ties with third countries and building the framework necessary to support European exports and investors in markets beyond Europe's jurisdiction. In other words, pursue in other markets the kind of strategies Europe applied to China after it began reform and opening up.